Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's Xtalks webinar. Today's talk is entitled, How to Build a Successful Decentralized Clinical Trial and Avoid Common Mistakes. My name is Aisha Rashid, and I'll be your Xtalks host for today. Today's talk will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers today. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank MRN who developed the content for this presentation. MRN understands the complexities of today's clinical trial environment and the burden this places on patients, clients, and sites. MRN services are designed to ease these burdens, from community researchers to investigator site professional support, accelerating patient recruitment and retention. MRN provides a platform for mainstream implementation of decentralized clinical trials. This is designed to speed up research, making trials more efficient, bringing drugs to the market quicker for pharma clients and for patients. MRN improves the patient's experience no matter where they are in the world. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Todd McGrath has over 16 years of experience in the clinical trial and life science industry, beginning his career in pharmaceutical and biotech consulting and then holding operational positions at Parexel, managing teams and projects. As Vice President of Global Head Project Management, Todd oversees MRN's global operations teams, developing and implementing project management strategies, continuous improvement and standardization across all regions. Todd's leadership has been instrumental in guiding MRN's pharma clients through the operational challenges that COVID-19 brought to their trial designs, sites, and patients. Alison Occhiuti, an accomplished clinical operations professional with over a decade of experience, is currently Associate Director of Clinical Operations at Magenta Therapeutics. She is responsible for the operational strategy and delivery of one of Magenta's early clinical programs. Prior to joining Magenta, Alison managed clinical trials at contract research organizations across a variety of indications before transitioning to the biopharmaceutical side in 2017. Since then, Alison has gained experience managing clinical trials for large pharma and small biotech companies with a distinct focus on rare diseases. In support of these rare disease trials and to mitigate the impact of COVID-19, Alison implemented decentralized clinical trial management, home care services, both prospectively and mid-studies. Without further ado, I'm going to pass over the controls and the mic to our speakers, Todd and Alison. You may begin when ready.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As we're getting into this discussion, really, Alison and I want to share with you today is our experiences in dealing with decentralized clinical trials and how we can give you some information that's going to be important to how to get to a successful one and to avoid some of the common mistakes that you might see when trying to perform decentralized trials. It's new to people. I'm sure as far as the individuals attending today, you might be talking about as far as your strategic plan within your organization, where you could fit decentralized trials into the the overall delivery. Some may have even participated in it, or obviously it's a very popular topic today. We talk about decentralized a lot in our conferences and a lot of our articles and press releases. So hopefully we can share a little bit more information with you on that. The first thing we want to talk about is the planning and design of your trial and things that you can do. We want to talk about the implementation of the DCT service. We'll look at some of the integration pieces, and that's both of vendors and of systems that you use, and we'll leave it open to questions at the end. So one of the, why we're here and why we want to talk about this is, some of the data, and when we look at this recently, over the past 7 years, decentralized trials are increasingly being used throughout the industry, and it's trying to make sure that we can put in a clinical trial that is patient focused. And it's increasingly of demand, and you can see the increase across up to 2020, and then leading into Q1 of 2021, there's over 50 trials already that are starting to use some component of a decentralized trial. That there is probably of no shock or surprise to anyone, I think, in the last year alone in dealing with a pandemic, and the quickly identifying that when the traditional model that we have used quite often, that patients are going back to a site to be seen and treated and observed for investigational trials, has been a challenge, and it's been difficult. A lot of the attention that was put and placed on COVID patients, institutions had to put that as that top priority, and that's where a lot of the immediate care had to be placed. And what that meant is the priority of clinical trials was it was lower, and we found that often those sites may have closed to investigation of products or the clinical trials themselves, which left the continuity of care for your patients at a huge risk of that you might have a delay in the trial, or they might not get their next treatment. In addition, you had patients that were quarantined and they were nervous about going back to sites. So again, no surprise that when we start talking about decentralized trials, how important it is to start thinking about these as our strategic plan going forward, and making sure we implement them. One of the things I think is interesting, if you look over at the right, this pie chart that we have, we talk about decentralized trials, but often we are probably only thinking about certain components of a decentralized trial, and by definition, we probably all could be thinking about it slightly different. But essentially, the decentralized trial, as we see it, is it's looking for the center of it all is that patient, and it's trying to think about how we can deliver clinical trials to a patient in a community setting. And you might use a variety or various components to do that. As you look at the percentages that are of these clinical trials, we have web-based systems that we use often, where they might be interacting with a system or through a system or a device. We're MRN really are heavily involved as the home trial support service, where we're sending out a home care professional into the patient's home or into a setting outside of the site in order to perform a trial. You have ePro, eCOA, applications that might be used, telemedicine where you have video conferencing that's ongoing. You have a hybrid, which could be a combination of these things. It could be telemedicine, it could be your ePro wearable devices. And then obviously you have remote monitoring, the digital health, and a lot of that is your wearable devices. But really, by definition, all of these things, even if only using one, start applying to what is a decentralized clinical trial. And in the last year, we definitely have seen a lot of conversation around the implementation of telemedicine, as well as home trial support services that are needed to conduct trials. So for the planning and design phase, I think probably very obvious thing to state is it's always important to just have early engagement. If you're thinking about doing a decentralized clinical trial, it's looking out there to start having conversations early on where probably you're still developing your protocol, or it's at a final draft stage before submission, that you can really get consultation from subject matter experts that have dealt in any one of those various components that I talked about on the other slide. So if you're thinking about using the technology services, or you're thinking about home trial support service or telemedicine, it's important to start engaging with them. Start asking about what is it that would be best practice, or what are the things, the risks that you have to take into consideration. One of the things that's really important is, when protocols come over through to the MRN in our review, is that we like to take it through and vet it out to multiple functional groups of subject matter experts in our organization. And that is looking at both from a clinical side in assessing the schedule of events, what assessments, by example, could be performed in home, what's the investigational product, what labs you can perform. And everybody's kind of weighing in and providing feedback on what they think is feasible, but also what things that potentially are at risk. Also vendors, looking out there for vendors that are actually working in various countries and being able to get, again, an assessment of feasibility and what can be performed in a home or in a decentralized setting. So Alison, how was your experience with home trial support or with a decentralized trial?
Yeah, Todd, I think you hit the nail on the head here. The early engagement is key. And so as mentioned in the beginning, I've implemented some aspects of decentralized clinical trials prospectively and midstream. And doing it midstream is very, very difficult. It's basically having to retrofit decentralized clinical trials into an entire structure that already exists, which is much easier said than done. So I think a big lessons learned that I want to pass on to anyone who's even considering decentralized clinical trials and toying with the idea is just look at it up front, ask the questions, engage with a provider, and just see what your options are. Because if you do that early, you're going to save yourself time and cost, quite frankly, later on. You might find out that something you thought wasn't possible is, and it's going to make your life and your patient's lives easier for years down the line. Or you may find out that maybe it's not a good fit, but at least and you can prevent some of the headache that you could experience if, as we saw last year, and we don't know how the world is going to evolve, if you all of a sudden have to make a quick change in the way that your study is being run. If you thought about these things up front, even if it wasn't implemented right away, a lot of those difficulties could be avoided. And I know one of the things that was tough for us was regarding the informed consent form. So Todd, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and this is that upfront kind of thinking about the ICFs, or the patient informed consent, and it's about trying to figure out how can you remain flexible, and what kind of language can you include in there, so that you're not trying to put this in retrospectively and having to obviously not only update it but also put it back through for review and IRB approvals. Some of the things that we consider for decentralized trial and the inclusion of some language in the ICF, even when we're thinking about decentralized trial, often we'll go, it's going to be done in the home, and they'll use specifically that word, that it's in the home. One of the things we would recommend is that you use something around it, that it's in an alternative location, and that it allows the flexibility, and it allows you to kind of have some sort of a contingency in there, so that it's not just a site, but it's not a home either, because the experience that we've had over the years in doing this is that patients are not always going to be seen in the home. They may be at a location. We've seen them at a vacation home. Sometimes they're in a temporary living space. And we've even had patients that were at like a Ronald McDonald program. And you can see where you want to be able to have that flexibility that's in an alternative location. We've seen them in the workplace. We've seen them in a school. But you can do that, and you can again focus on that patient you want to do things that will fit within their lifestyle, that is going to not be a burden for them, and you can adjust accordingly. The other thing that's important is that information is going to be shared with a third party. I know a lot of us, we think about the patients as they come into screening and they begin to get randomized. A lot of that patient identifiable information obviously is at the front end of it. We try to make sure that that is minimized, and that eventually they have a subject ID or patient ID that we would refer to them as they go through the trial, obviously for data protection and data privacy. However, when you're thinking about decentralized trials, there is information that will have to be shared in order to be able to conduct it successfully. And that, at minimum, you have to have a patient's name, you have to have a patient's address, and you might even have to have the month or the year of birth that will be circulated through specific documents in order to conduct a clinical trial in a decentralized setting. And that's because if you just, by example, if you think about if labs are going to have to be picked up from a patient's home, obviously we're going to need that address. If IMP or an investigational product has to be picked up at a pharmacy and delivered to a patient's home, again, they have to have it. And then when a healthcare professional goes out to the home, they have to have the patient's name and at least something that is a unique identifier, which is typically that month or year of date of birth, just as a way to say, you are the person that was referred to this as home trial support. I need to make sure it is you that I'm treating.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know, especially in some of the ex-US countries where we conduct these trials, that data privacy is something that IRBs and health authorities really take a lot of time to work through, which again speaks to putting this information up front. I had a trial where we put the information for decentralized clinical trial services in the ICF, again, midstream, and we actually had patients that were missing visits, that were going without their treatment because we were waiting for these ICFs to go through IRBs. Then there were, all these rules about how the patient could sign them depending on the country, if they could do it remotely or not. And so there was an interruption in their treatment and in their care while we were trying to get this done. And that was extremely frustrating for us as a sponsor and for the patients and their caregivers. So when we're thinking about continuity of care and really putting the patients first, doing this work up front can really make a difference.
So some of the things that you'd want to ask, I think, as you're going through it, and it really goes down to like that schedule of the schedule of events in your protocol. It's looking at every single visit and what are the requirements that are going to be for the patient, and seeing how you might be able to tailor that specifically with this idea that you want to conduct a decentralized clinical trial. Obviously, there's when you look at those schedule of events, there are so many visits that you might be able to look at and go, okay, this is one that you have to have at site. Perhaps there's MRI or there's CT scans or something that has to be performed, and that obviously has to go within a brick and mortar site. There's going to be others that you might be able to do through having a home care professional go out to the home and perform. They could do labs, and they can do IMP, or they can do administration, subcutaneous injections, and even infusions, which sometimes people don't think that that's possible. They can do ECGs. The general rule is if a nurse can carry it in a piece of equipment or device, it's likely they can do it in the home. Other things to take in consideration is, whether or not there's just that hybrid approach that I was referring to earlier. You might be able to do situations where the healthcare professional goes out and does a certain number of visits that are specific for labs, and they might be able to do IMP, but you also might have physical assessments that are performed, and that is where you have to be very careful about what kind of health care professional is being used for the clinical trial. Sometimes we might actually tailor that a bit and say that you can send out a nurse practitioner or perhaps a physician's assistant in order to do those. Or you might have in like a symptoms-led exam where you can have telemedicine, and you would have the physician on the other side of that, and that they're kind of interacting between three people. It's a physician, a healthcare professional in the home that can do the physical touch in face-to-face with that patient. Study populations is another thing to just be considerate of. Obviously, what's the indication therapeutic area? What's the disease progression? Often thinking about, as the trials are ongoing, how is the mobility of that patient going to be impacted, especially in certain therapeutic areas? You might find that some of the later stages of those visits might be something that you want to include for decentralized trials versus some that are upfront. Countries that are involved, there's a lot to be considered there, but mainly is to think about those countries that just might have some local regulations and limitations to what can be done in a decentralized setting. For example, there are some countries that you might have limitations on pediatrics, and if IMP is being administered in the home, you might be able to only do that with an actual doctor or a physician. You want to take into consideration culture. It's a big thing that sometimes just we don't look at it carefully enough, and it's important to have those subject matter experts in the country to speak to those things, to say, how would we conduct ourselves when going into the home? The other thing, blinding considerations. I know we all talk about this quite a bit, but when you're doing a decentralized clinical trial, the blinding considerations slightly change, and it's mainly because, especially I'll just IMP administrations and different things. You're thinking about a pharmacy that might be prepping something, and then there's an administration happening. When you go to a decentralized training, someone might be prepping it and then sending it, and we have to make sure that you remain blinded at all times, the product as it's going through. Thinking about how you're going to ship couriers. A lot of times we think about the use of the IMP stability is how long, once prepped, how long can it stay in transit? How does it have to be temperature controlled? What kind of shippers should be used? The temperature monitoring devices that have to be put into the shippers. We have to plan for also the cross-border shipping in some cases. It's just about considerations of customs and how those things might be impacted, or what kind of delays you might have to expect, and put that into your planning. And the last thing I'll just mention is just about with couriers is there's a lot of thought. There's a lot of providers out there. And you have your FedEx, your DHL, the UPS. They're global, and obviously can be used. But it's one thing when you're starting to deal with a clinical trial that a lot of the things that we do are time-based. It's really important that you start looking towards a courier or a premium courier that doesn't necessarily give you a window of when they're going to drop something off. You want a premium courier that's saying, I can be there on that exact time at that exact place within 10 to 15 minute window, versus what you might get from others that say, I could be there within a 4-hour time period. So there's a lot of variables to it, and a lot of things to consider. Alison, is there anything that you found that are risks?
Oh my gosh! I mean, the courier is such a big one. I can't tell you. I've worked with quite a few different decentralized clinical trial providers, and they all do things a little bit differently. And I think one of the biggest frustrations is when you have to put IP on a plane and it has to get picked up by a courier off the plane and brought to the patient's house, and you have the nurse at the house and the patient's at the house, and the drug doesn't show up because it missed the flight, and so I think as a sponsor, a lot of the time we hear things such as premium courier or things like that, and dollar signs start popping up, but you really can't put a price on kind of the patient experience, because you can imagine you're sitting at home and you're waiting and the nurse is there and all of that, and the drug doesn't come. And so it really is important to really look at the risks in the process, because they are there. I mean, Todd, you named so many different things that we have to think about. It's a very, very complex web of a lot of moving pieces that have to work together in the right way to work. And there's a huge human element to that. Nurses can get sick. Weather, for example, weather issues. There are risks, and just identifying them up front and mitigating them together as a team between sponsor, provider, site and looking at the process as a whole and just seeing where those challenge points may be and identifying mitigation and contingency plans up front. A lot of those things can be addressed. They can't be prevented all the time. This is not a perfect process. It's a lot better than it was. I started doing decentralized clinical trials probably about 3 years ago. And just in that time frame, I think COVID really sped things up. Things have improved a lot. So it's definitely improving very quickly, but it's not perfect. And I think sites and sponsors need to understand that it's not a cure-all for everything, but knowing the risks up front and having mitigations for those can really help.
Yeah, I think it definitely is a very good point. It's a complex process. I think that you, when using the right providers and the right services, you start mitigating a lot of the different risks that are there. But it's not perfect in the end. It's knowing that there always needs to be somewhat of a backup plan. And I think there typically always is a backup plan. And we, even to the extent of saying, if this doesn't happen in the home, or this doesn't happen exactly how we want, can that patient make it back to site? It's trying to plan accordingly to say, how is our protocol? What kind of protocol windows can you be looking at? Can you plan the visit up at the early part of a protocol window so that in the event that something does go wrong, that you might be able to reschedule and still get it within protocol and not have a deviation? So I think really you need to create that foundation and be all working together, as Alison's talking about. It's everyone. It's the sponsor, it's the CRO if they're involved, it's an HTS provider, it's the technology, all of those different things working together to give you a good foundation for a successful clinical trial.
Absolutely. So I think when we talk about all the planning and all the upfront thinking, then it comes time to actually implement, right? And to take action. So one of the biggest things is you can plan a beautiful decentralized clinical trial and have all the pieces lined up. But if your principal investigators are not on board, it really doesn't make a difference. These are their patients. A lot of the times, and I come from the world of rare diseases, these physicians sometimes have known these patients their whole lives and known their caregivers their whole lives. And the bonds there are really tight. And even in non-rare diseases, these patients, they're ill and they depend on these healthcare providers to help them. So it is so important not to lose sight of the fact that the relationship between the site staff, the PI, the healthcare providers, and the patient and caregivers still needs to be a central point to this entire process, even though the visit won't necessarily occur at the site. So there's things to consider to get your PIs on board. And I think one of the biggest things is get them involved early. Start talking to the staff and the PIs during feasibility. Ask them, do you have experience with decentralized trials? Do you have concerns? Are there questions you might want answered? What are some things that we could do to help you feel comfortable with this process? And another thing I found, if you can do it, this isn't possible on all trials, but identify an ally. Find a PI or a sub-I or someone who's done it before who can speak to the other investigators and tell their story and tell it truthfully in a common language. Say, these are things that were really great. These are things that were kind of challenging. And that physician to physician connection is often more powerful than anything, that either the sponsor or the DCT provider can do. I think the biggest things that these investigators are often thinking about worldwide, this is regardless of where they are, is continuation of care when they are not there, and delegation to an experienced and qualified healthcare provider, depending on what it is that actually needs to be done.
And Very important point, and it's so important that in the beginning is that when we're interacting with, if you're going to, for a healthcare professional, it's going to be out in the home that's doing something, activities that are delegated by that physician, is really clearly understanding what are the roles and responsibilities, who's doing what, and when those are going to be performed. And a lot of the questions that we get from physicians is that they want to be able to, obviously, as it's responsible per GCP, they have to have that appropriate oversight of a healthcare professional that's out in the home, because that healthcare professional is an extension of that site and of that PI. One of the things that we always encourage is, if we can get up to have engaging conversations earlier on, whether those be at investigator meetings or we start having meetings that are scheduled with the physician, we can really start going over all of the PI oversight responsibilities. We can talk about how the nurses will be identified, how we will look, what qualifications we're looking for, and how those nurses, we would submit to them their CVs, how they've been trained. We can even go as far as needed, especially in these rare diseases and some of the pediatric the trials that we see. It's important that the healthcare professional can meet the PI, and they can meet the caregivers, and we can have and arrange for those meetings with them, so they can do that in advance, and they can start to understand and build a relationship before they're actually going out into the home. But it's a lot about how to talk about the process and the way that information is going to flow, and how data is going to be sent back to the investigator, so they can oversee the information that's coming through to make sure the continuation of care of that patient and have the proper medical oversight. And the other thing that we do sometimes is just having a follow-up call post-visit, is making sure that a healthcare professional phones up and can possibly have even 5 minutes with the physician to talk about how the visit went. And at that point, have any additional questions or concerns, they can talk to one-on-one between the medical professionals.
Yeah, we actually did that on a study that I worked on previously, and it really made a difference. And I think it highlights the point that everybody, and we sort of referenced this a little bit before, but everybody needs to be committed to this process. So, if the PI wants to have a little bit more involvement, they have to be available. It doesn't just disappear because the nurse is at the home or perhaps treating the patient somewhere else, but everybody involved has to be committed to this process, and the fact that it's going to work a little bit differently than perhaps a standard clinical trial does. But if you get your site staff, especially, as we're talking about in this case, engaged, then that commitment is there.
It's really, you mentioned that with decentralized clinical trials, you find that it's focused around that patient, and so it's focused around their lives and how we can actually provide care to them, really in a convenient way. So patients will request that, that they can do visits possibly in the evening, or they might request that visits are going to happen on the weekend. And being that everyone has to be committed to this, it's, healthcare professionals that we identify have to be able to accommodate that kind of schedule and need to be able to get out to the home when a patient would like to be seen. But there also has to be a commitment from the site, and especially either a PI or a sub-I, that they're available under emergency, or that we can call in and speak to someone if in the event that there is any concerns, or if perhaps there needs to be additional medical advisement or in discussions that have to happen. So that's always has to be taken into consideration. Everyone has to be committed to it, as you said, Alison. I think, and it just to speak to a few other things, it's just creating the space, specifically for some of these trials, for making sure you can build that relationship and the trust between everyone that's involved. And it's not always standard practice, but it's something that we will offer. It's something that we think is is advisable under certain circumstances is that you really can set up in advance where nurses or home care professionals go to the sites. They meet the patient, they meet the physician, they have conversations. There could be observational visits that are conducted there where they're actually seeing a visit being conducted. The labs, they can see where how the IMP is being prepped or how it's being administered, where the healthcare professional is at that point just a person in the room, making sure that they're observing everything. And then prior to their actually doing anything or conducting it in the home itself. I think there's also, you could do teleconferences as well. I mean, in this world that we're living in now, where a lot of the things are doing virtually, and taking into consideration, a lot of the healthcare professionals that we identify are closer to the patient in proximity in their location. We don't necessarily identify healthcare professionals to do decentralized trials that are close in proximity to a site. So there's always that concern of going, well, how much travel time would that healthcare professional have to take into to get to a site to actually perform that visit? So doing teleconferences, doing a video, it's recommended. We definitely can put it into practice where you could just have a chat between a healthcare professional and a PI so they can have a conversation and ask questions. And again, building that, just kind of reassuring the PI to go, I have the right healthcare professional that's going to go out and take care of my patient.
Yep, absolutely, Todd. And I think that did wonders for us, especially the trial I worked on during COVID, where it was happening very quickly. And letting the PI know that they had those options to meet these people, whether it was virtually or in person, it did make them feel a little more at ease for sure. So it's a really great option. So we've talked about planning, we've talked about our PIs, and I think one of the things that is near and dear to my heart is the integration of other vendors and systems. So I think that especially those of us who work in clinical operations, there are many, many pieces to running a clinical trial. And when you think about decentralized clinical trials, and Todd really showed this at the beginning with that pie chart, this is not just a nurse or a healthcare professional visiting a patient's home and maybe taking some blood samples or in some cases giving an injection or something like that. This is a huge piece of your overall study operations, and it needs to be considered part of the entire pie. So as I also mentioned earlier, trying to back decentralized clinical trials into an existing framework is really, really hard, which is why early engagement is so unbelievably critical. A lot of the services that we look at, so IRT, so interactive response technologies, electronic data captures, their standard way of operating and of building things and of interacting with their sponsors assumes that studies are going to be run at sites, because that's how they've been run for years now. When we're starting to see the trend move a little bit, but I think it's going to take a while for everybody to catch up there. So it's to understand how DCT is really going to look on your trial, you have to get all of these pieces talking to each other. So that again goes back to early engagement, and it goes back to as the sponsor looking at the whole layout and saying, okay, I have these 6 different vendors. How are they going to be impacted by the fact that this piece will be done decentralized? And I think a DCT provider is a great resource and can give so much good advice, and they're there to ask questions, but they don't necessarily see the whole piece. And that is really something that as a sponsor, you need to be aware of when you're looking at this, is really seeing the big picture, bringing the questions and the concerns to the table to the right people to discuss, and bringing the right groups together to discuss.
I think we have found that in those situations where we start engaging we might be focused on home trial support services or sending a healthcare professional into the home. We will talk with a sponsor or perhaps even a CRO, and they'll mention we have a system that we're using for data collection, and we would like your nurses to use it. The things that you have to start considering around this, around decentralized trials, is that what pieces of equipment are actually going to be distributed and how many you will need. Because what was originally maybe a plan to go, oh, well, this patient will have a device. And I'll just take by example, if they're doing like ePro, you might have a device that they're using. And oftentimes you will hear, well, can't the nurse just use the device that the patient's having? Or they might be using, it's kind of a bring your own device plan. And it's things to take into consideration, because a lot of the times the nurse might be going out on that clinical trial. They might not be just seeing one patient. They might be seeing multiple patients. So you likely would want to have two pieces of kit or two pieces of equipment that are being given. One that might be for a patient, one that's for that nurse, so that they can take with them and continue on. We definitely don't want usually to be, thinking about, again, the convenience part of decentralized clinical trials. The last thing you want to do is have for a bring your own device type practice is that, a patient would be sharing their own device with a personal device with another healthcare professional. It's private, right? A lot of times they're going, I wouldn't want to do that. And then the other thing is about these systems and the way they're designed and developed. They're typically, when you're first thinking about it, is you might be looking at going in your traditional setting and how information is being gathered at a site and how they are interacting with various departments within a facility or institution. When you start thinking about decentralized clinical trials, you have to be thinking about how is data being recorded by a healthcare professional that's actually entering in the home, one that arrives to the patient's home, receives a shipment from a courier, unpacks it, brings it into the home, how they initially greet that patient and they start maybe take their vitals, how they would go over AEs, what conmeds they've been taking. The overall administration then might take place. And then there's an observation period. Well, you have to be thinking about how your system was developed. Is it in order of the way that data has how I've just described, rather than a nurse having or a healthcare professional having to jump around in a system? We want to make sure it's convenient and it's in a logical order for them to conduct a visit efficiently.
I think that's so huge. One big challenge that I've seen on different trials is labs. I think blood collection in the home is something that's pretty common for decentralized clinical trials. But thinking about, okay, are we using a central lab for these? Are we using a local lab? Are we using both? You would be surprised at the number of different processes that a nurse in the home would have to go through, depending on how that worked. A trial I worked on had 3 different lab vendors, and it was a big training point. And it's not to say that can't be done, because it absolutely can, but it's really, really thinking about how that's going to work, and then the process and budget implications of that. So getting, again, really thinking about vendor processes, thinking about the way that data is flowing is so unbelievably crucial.
I think one of the things that with MRN, as we work through this and some of those integration pieces, we often find ourselves in conversations where they're with so many parties that are involved. Sometimes the sponsor or a clinical research organization they want to remain in some level of control of a lot of those processes that are happening. When you're looking at a decentralized clinical trial, you have to be a little bit more open-minded about this, in that often in the instance where a healthcare professional is going out into the home, it's more important, I think, to have a healthcare professional that is helping manage all of the various pieces, like the coordination of couriers picking up IMP from a pharmacy, and bringing it to a patient's home. The healthcare professional scheduling when a lab that will be picked up or a sample will be picked up from the home and when it will be taken to a local or a central lab. You have to give over some level of control by a person that's out in the field doing the work, and it's just really important. And then we often find ourselves, if it doesn't work that way, there's a lot more headaches, because there's then you have, if you want to say, too many cooks in the kitchen, like where everyone is trying to coordinate some piece of that process flow, and in the end you just want to centralize it. You just want to have one person, and it might seem like a lot, but it works, and we've seen it work at MRN. If you have that one healthcare professional that's going, I'm the one interacting with the patient to schedule the visit in the home. I'm then coordinating with the site to let them know when that visit's going to happen. I know when the courier is going to pick up investigational product and be delivered. I know when the courier is going to drop a lab sample off the local or central lab. Because if any one of those things that we talked about earlier, like the risks that you could have, any delay, traffic delay, weather, all of the things, the courier would just contact that one individual, that one healthcare professional that's going to be doing the visit in the home, and they'll say, I'm running 15 minutes late. Right away they go, I'm reaching out to patient, I'll have a conversation with them, or I know I'm going to have to stay here a little bit longer. And they can arrange all of those things. And that is one thing that I would recommend to avoid some of the headaches, because it's having a bit of just, you have to give control over to the individual that's going to be doing that decentralized clinical trial.
Absolutely.
All right, to be successful in decentralized clinical trial, I hope that we were able to cover a lot of what you have to consider in the planning, in the implementation stage. But in the end, if I could tell everyone to take away this message, is that decentralized clinical trials are about the patient. It's about doing something for them to allow them to have the medical care in a convenient and less burdensome way. And that's what we're trying to do. And it's about bringing a community together to deliver a clinical trial for a patient.
It really is. It's a long-term investment, I think, for the patients, for sponsors, and we've talked about so many things to consider, and a lot of sponsors I've heard say, well, we don't know if this is something we'd be able to do. Explore it. Talk to a provider, do a cost analysis, think about long-term goals, label claims, the patient population you're working with, the length of your study. It really is something worth exploring, and patients, they really do appreciate it. They really do.
All right. I think we're, Asha, I think we're going to open it up to questions at this point. Is that right?
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much to our speakers for that very, very insightful discussion. And that's right, we are heading into our Q&A session for this presentation now. So I'd like to invite our audience members to continue sending in their questions and comments using that chat box, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. So I've already received some questions here, and we'll begin with those. So a question that we have here for our speakers is Reconsent required when decentralization services are integrated with an ongoing clinical trial?
I can take that. So if it's not already in your informed consent form, then yes, absolutely, reconsent would be required. And that's something, again, that we sort of talked about a little bit earlier about how that process is not instantaneous. And there's a lot of steps to getting a new consent form approved and then, getting it signed and all of that. So it's something to plan for upfront if you can.
Great. So let's move on to another question. And we have one from an audience member that's asking, what is the future of decentralized trials after the end of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Todd, I'll let you go first on that one.
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yeah, I believe that the last year has further, opened all of our eyes to just go, the decentralized model is the way of the future. So I think it's going to be a series of probably the combination of a lot of those different components that I was mentioning earlier, and thinking about these hybrid type model in delivery and design. So the implementation of using technology with a healthcare professional, that's what I refer to as a hybrid. And I do not think that in any situation that we're going to eliminate the traditional elements of some of the clinical trials. I mean, it's still going to be ongoing. We're still going to have visits that have to be conducted at a site or within an institution. But I do find that a lot of those events, the schedule of events, and a lot of the visits that we perform, we will be looking at saying which ones can be performed in a patient's home or an alternative location with a combination of with telemedicine. And I think telemedicine is going to be another large part of it. And it's the ability for that physician to be able to have a video conference with a healthcare professional in the home with a patient, or it might be a physician just with a patient individually, or maybe a healthcare professional that MRN provides that talks with a patient. There are so many different scenarios that you could play out there, but I think that's likely to be the future. It's going to be telemedicine in combination with a healthcare professional and having some visits that will be performed at the site.
And I'll also just say that even before COVID, and I saw this accelerating with COVID, and I'll speak for the rare disease space, we were receiving letters from patient advocacy groups asking for when we were going to start doing some sort of decentralized model. A lot of these rare diseases require very intensive treatment, every couple weeks for years. And we were getting letters saying, when are you going to do this? Our children need to be in school, or I need to work. And so patients want this, and they've wanted it for a long time. And I think now that COVID kind of brought this more into mainstream and some patients have seen it, now they've had a taste of it and they want it to continue. So I think that this is something that from a regulatory standpoint, I think we'll start seeing more and more of this. I think we as an industry are really going to have to start taking this very seriously, looking at almost any kind of trial, because patients want it.
Thank you very much for those answers. Another question that we have here is, given the cost implication with DCTs, with digital health devices, HC, couriers, etc., what is the ROI, and has DCT matured enough to obtain this data, as ROI can deter sponsors?
That's a very fair question. So I'll give a personal experience. So one of the trials that I worked on, I've actually done this a couple of times. So if you think about all the costs that go into a trial in general, a lot of the costs you would usually have if you were to switch to a decentralized model will disappear on the site side. And it'll get picked up by the decentralized model. It actually, in this particular circumstance, it came out net neutral in terms of cost. So I know that, cost is a big thing. It is. And as we've chatted about a little bit, is you have to be thinking about your patients and thinking about what makes sense. So, those premium couriers, you may question, well, is that worth it or not? It depends on, each trial, but I can say from my own experience, Yes, it is. And a lot of these costs that may seem in isolation kind of scary, if you do a cost analysis and look at your study or your program, your clinical program as a whole, it really isn't as crazy as you would think. Again, that is not the case for every study. I can't, make that generalization for everyone, but in my experience, that's been what I've seen. And again, the patients love it, and you can't put a price on that.
Definitely, Alison, your points are, I think spot on. And for the return on investment, as far as when we look at it at MRN, the data is that we have collected on the percentage of patients that you're able to recruit and further retain and stay in the trial, I think are far greater when you offer there. You see a drastic increase, at least from what we've seen in our data. You're definitely seeing screening and randomization go up higher on these, upwards of 60% or higher. And then those retention rates are nearly about 80 to 90% of the patients that are referred to us stay in the trial. And I mean, those numbers just alone, if you just look at our MRN data, are much higher than what we know in the industry. So I would say that, as far as return on investment, you're likely to, when offering a decentralized clinical trial, you're going to end up having those patients that are coming in, and Alison's mentioned, they are interested in it, they want it, they want this to happen, and they're going to stay. And I think, but as long as you go through the right planning and the design, they're going to stay. You will retain them, and they'll want to stay in the clinical trial. So it's bringing that your clinical trial. You're probably speeding up the delivery of it over the end. Again, taking into consideration that ROI. How fast can you possibly get an investigational drug in for review and approval and out to market so you can start treating patients? Alison, I will definitely, we've seen where there's savings, and then we've seen where it's cost neutral, but everyone has to be committed to it. It's about that patient.
Couldn't agree more, Todd.
Well, thank you very much for all of those answers. We've reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at MRN may follow up with you, or you can direct your questions to the contact information slide that we have up here, and you can send them an email using that email indicated on your screen. So I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen, so your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, I'm about to send you a link in your chat box, and you'll be able to view the recording of this event on that page. And you can also share that link with your colleagues when they register for the recording as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, I'd like to please join us in thanking today's Todd McGrath and Alison Occhiuti. Thank you very much to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for your attendance today and the questions that were sent through. As mentioned, please contact us, reach out to us with the information provided on the screen, and we can always follow up and address further questions for you. But thank you for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. We hope you found this webinar informative, everyone. Have a great day.